You are listening to The Central Cast, a podcast for mystics and misfits just like you, recorded every week in Pasadena, California, before a live audience. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Max. I want to begin today with a story from Matthew chapter 12, where Jesus says something kind of surprising. He says, you can be forgiven for just about anything. You can be forgiven for speaking against me. You can talk all the shit you want about me. But the one thing you can't be forgiven for, he says, is speaking against or blaspheming the Spirit. And there's always been a lot of confusion about what is he talking about? What does it mean to blaspheme the Holy Spirit and be guilty, therefore, of the quote-unquote unforgivable eternal sin? I don't know about you, but I grew up being utterly terrified that I was going to accidentally do this somehow because it was so confusing as to what it was. But I grew up in the church, as many of you know, Pentecostal, right? Which means we focus on the gifts of the Holy Spirit, like speaking in tongues, being slain in the Spirit, ecstatic forms of worship, exorcisms, divine healing, all that stuff. But anyway, so I was told that blaspheming the Spirit could mean a lot of things, but it definitely included making fun of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, like speaking in tongues. And yet we kind of still did as kids, growing up in the Pentecostal church. I remember we would try to like come up with English phrases that sounded like someone speaking in tongues. And so a few of them were, and we're all going to hell if you laugh at this, but what was like, I bought a Chevy, should have bought a Kia. And then there was see my bow tie, tie my bow tie. You had to be there, but no, you didn't want to be there. But if you say those really fast, I bought a Chevy, should have bought a Kia. Okay, it sounds like someone speaking in tongues, right? But this is probably not what Jesus was talking about. Matthew's Jesus was talking about when he was talking about blaspheming the Spirit, right? Instead, if we look at the surrounding context of that story, he's responding to the religious authorities of his day who were saying that the only reason why he has the power he does to, perform miracles, cast out demons, heal the sick, it was because he himself is demon possessed, they said. They said, it is only by Beelzebul, the prince of demons, that you have, or that this man has the power to cast out demons and heal the sick. To which Jesus basically responds, why would Satan be working against himself? That makes no sense, right? In other words, what the religious authorities were doing, were saying that the good Jesus was doing in the world, helping the infirmed, liberating the oppressed, that this good was somehow actually demonic and evil. And again, Jesus is like, talk all the shit you want about me, but don't twist goodness into evil and righteousness into wickedness. And this is what I think Matthew's Jesus meant by blaspheming the Spirit. The Spirit is presented in the Gospels as that which inspires us and empowers us to do good in the world, to love, to bring goodness and liberation and healing and peace into the world. To call that evil, to call love and goodness and liberation, healing and peace evil, shows a corruption of the heart on the deepest level. And it's really hard to change if that's the state of one's heart. It's like an eternal sin, if you will, a sin against yourself, a sin against your own humanity and the humanity of others. And it's really hard to come back from that if that's the case. And this is what I think it means to blaspheme the Spirit. And we see this in a lot of people today. How many of you have heard about the so-called sin of empathy? Have you heard of this before? This is a common evangelical talking point today, the sin of empathy. And the idea is that there's something wrong about allowing oneself to be guided by empathy and love and compassion, especially when considering, how to treat LGBTQ folks, especially trans folks, and whether or not they should be allowed to use the bathrooms they want and the pronouns they want and receive the health care they want. We're told there's something actually evil and wicked about being guided by our empathy for them in these circumstances. Or we're told that there's something anti-Christian and wicked about being guided by empathy for migrants and how we should treat them and whether or not we should allow ICE to brutalize them in the street and hunt them down. This is what I think it means to blaspheme the Spirit. And I bring this up today because I want to talk about the importance of moral clarity and moral courage at a time like this, at a moment like this in history, when moral clarity and moral courage are getting scarce and challenged, especially in the church, as many Christians sound a lot like the religious authorities in Jesus' day, who have somehow twisted love and empathy into something perverse or something sinful and dirty, which is ironic because, these same Christians would fully agree that Jesus says in the Gospels that the greatest commandment and that the summation of all the law and the prophets, the highest standard of God's will for us is to what? The golden rule, to love your neighbor as yourself and to treat others as you would want to be treated. What is Jesus talking about there? He's talking about empathy. He's talking about being guided by compassion and empathy for each other in the way that we think about how we should live in the world and how we should live with each other, be guided by empathy and love and compassion. That this is the summation of God's will for you. This is the summation of the law and the prophets and the greatest command. Love others as you love yourself. They would fully acknowledge that that's the greatest command. But they obviously have not thought that all the way through. And not just that, right? But so when I speak of moral clarity and moral courage this morning, I'm not just talking about the need for it in the church, but I'm talking about the need for it throughout our culture. And what I mean by moral clarity and moral courage is the commitment and resolve to both recognize and resist racism, xenophobia, and fascism where it's happening. I'm talking about the refusal to be gaslit into thinking that what's happening today is somehow normal and okay. I'm talking about the commitment and resolve to name evil, speak truth to power, and take risks doing so. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about moral clarity and moral courage this morning. And the irony of this moment is not lost on me. Here I am, a progressive pastor, preaching a sermon about moral clarity and moral courage. This seems very evangelical or even kind of conservative to me, right? This is the conservative kind of sermon topic. Moral clarity, moral courage. We progressive Christians usually get labeled the moral relativists, do we not? Right? We're told we're moral relativists because we want to have premarital sex and gay sex and drink beer and swear, and we want to critically examine our faith. All the big sins, right? The worst sins you can possibly imagine. The fact is, we're not really the moral relativists. They are. And I know I'm being hard on evangelicals this morning, and I can't avoid that. As a former evangelical, it's hard not to be. But, evangelicals are really the moral relativists. And we see it actually on display this week quite profoundly with the reaction in response to Trump's racist posts about the Obamas, right? I'm hearing, it really wasn't him, and if it was an accident. He didn't really mean it. This is so out of character for him. Yada yada yada. And actually, to be fair to evangelicals, I'm actually hearing an equal amount of pushback from the right. I'm seeing pastors that I'm still friends with back east who are very conservative saying this is clearly wrong and racist and calling out even those in their comment thread who are coming to Trump's defense. But overall, this is the problem. I think this is a problem in evangelicalism, this kind of moral relativism. Anyone who can excuse, normalize, and sanitize racism, fascism, sexual predation, pathological lying, etc., such a person is really the moral relativist. We're not. But I digress. We need moral clarity and moral courage today, not just for ourselves and our contemporaries, but for those yet to come. Because the generations to come after us will look back on us now, this moment in history, and the story we're writing about ourselves. We are writing a story right now that others down the road, our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will look back on the same way we look back on those who fought fascism and injustice before and ask, what did they do in the moment of truth when democracy, decency, civil rights, and human rights were on the line? We are writing that story right now. We are writing our own story right now that posterity will look back on and hopefully find inspiration when it's their turn to take a stand. They are counting on us. Last week, I mentioned a post by our good friend Andre Henry, spoken here before, who's a Black artist and activist. And he said this: take hope, don't despair, because we already know how to fight fascism. The civil rights movement, for example, was an anti-fascist movement. The push for gay rights and trans rights has been an anti-fascist movement. The fight against Christian nationalism has been an anti-fascist movement. And certainly the fight against ICE and their terror campaign is an anti-fascist movement. The truth is, we've been fighting fascism forever here. And this means we can draw upon the past for inspiration, wisdom, hope, and strength. And Andre goes on to say that fascism isn't new to America, because if you're Black in America, you know that America has been fascist, has always been fascist. In fact, during the 1930s, and I talked about this last week, but it bears repeating, Nazi Germany studied our immigration laws and Jim Crow laws and used them as a template, as a model for building what became the Nuremberg laws, a series of anti-Semitic and racist laws instituted by the Third Reich in 1935. So what we're seeing today in the US isn't America acting like Nazi Germany, but America acting like America. And again, Andre points all this out to say, take hope, don't despair, because fascism isn't new here. It's just our turn to fight it. And we don't have to start from scratch or grope in the dark for solutions. We can look to those who came before and take lessons from their story, learn from them, draw on them to know what to do. And hopefully we will add our stories to theirs and thereby give future generations an even greater history to draw upon when it's their turn to fight. And I wonder what role our faith can have in this moment in time, this moment in history. Can our faith have a role? Can it be a source of moral clarity and moral courage? I don't know. I'm interested, as always, to hear your point of view on that. I personally think so, but to be clear, I no longer subscribe to the idea that believing in God or going to church or being a Christian inherently makes someone a better person. In fact, I think more often than not, the more religious a person is, the more immoral they tend to be. I don't know why that is. I mean, I can speculate. But why is it that the worst people I know are often the most religious people as well? That's more than just a coincidence. I'm reminded of Slavoj Žižek's words: without religion, good people would be good and bad people would be bad, but it often takes religion to make good people bad. Now, some would respond to that and say, well, then why in the world are you still a Christian and a pastor, no less? And that's a good question, and there's a few reasons why. And one of them I got from Zizek as well, who likes to say, Christianity is too important of an idea to surrender to the fundamentalists. Fuck them. They can't have it. They hijacked it, and we're taking it back, if only in some small way. I like that. So yeah, for me, Christianity is too important of an idea. It's too important of an idea to surrender to the fundamentalists and the charlatans. But I'm also reminded of the words of James Baldwin, that great Black writer, civil rights activist, and orator, who said, I conceive of God as a means of liberation and not as a means to control others. If the concept of God has any validity or any use today, it is to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, then it's time that we got rid of him. Hear that again. If the concept of God has any validity or any use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, then it's time that we got rid of him. I agree with that. And it's okay if you've gotten rid of God. How many times have you heard a pastor say that on Sunday morning? I can understand why some need to do that. But I think for most of us, myself included, God has not outlived his usefulness, which is to say that faith and spirituality has not outlived its usefulness, which is a way to say that that shared sacred stories have not outlived their usefulness. We need shared sacred stories, I believe. We need shared sacred stories to unite around, to build community around. There's something inherently powerful, I think, about shared sacred stories, rich with myth and metaphor that inspire us and move us, that speak to the depths of our humanity, like poetry. These stories that connect us and ground us in something bigger than ourselves, something that's ineffable and transcendent, that defies vocabulary words. We need shared sacred stories that can speak to that depth of our human experience, I believe. These stories that are ancient and rich with tradition and history, like Christianity is. I think there's something really powerful about that. And I don't want to lose that. I don't want to surrender that to the fundamentalists and to the charlatans and to those who would wield these stories to harm and to oppress, when these stories are so often there because they developed in an oppressed community, among an oppressed people who use them for liberation and hope and strength in their fight for their own humanity and their belief in a God who loves all and is a God of healing and hope and renewal. Let's not, I don't want to give that up. I think it's important to remember that religion, faith, and spirituality played a huge role in the civil rights movement. I don't think a lot of people today are aware just how much the civil rights movement in the 1960s was a deeply religious movement. Yes, it was also a political movement, right? On the surface, it was about civil rights, voting rights, desegregating the South, right? But James Cone points out, and we talked about James a little bit last week. Of course, he was a Black theologian, Black seminary professor, activist, lived in the 60s. I think he died about 10 years ago. He was always quick to point out that what drove the Black community to action in the 1960s, what mobilized them and got them into the streets and willing to risk their own necks, was deep theological and spiritual convictions, mostly Christian in nature, because of the influence of leaders like MLK. But one must also realize, he points out, that Malcolm's Islam played a big role in the Black Power movement. We often don't think about that or hear about that. And James Cone is often credited as being the thinker and the writer who bridged the ideologies of Malcolm and Dr. King, meaning he bridged the Black Power and Islamic ideology of Malcolm and the nonviolent Christian-informed ideology of King. But again, the point is the civil rights movement, it's a deeply religious movement, a deeply religious, spiritual movement. Let's not forget that. And I think this points to how religion, faith, and spirituality and these stories from our tradition, how these things can be a great tool for social justice still, and a community organizing technology, if you will, and something we can use for collective liberation and to speak to this moment in time and to find moral clarity and moral courage in. So that's my talk for this morning. And as always, we want to open it up for dialogue and discussion, questions, comments. What did this bring up for you? Maybe a good discussion question would be, what does moral clarity look like for you? What does moral courage look like for you in your context? Yeah, anything goes. Oh, thanks, Bob. Yeah, Anna.
I don't know if this is so much of a question, but just kind of, I don't know, your talk brought it up. Like, I had like a text conversation with my mom and asking her, like, what's your church? Like, their church is like a couple thousand in a suburb of Cleveland.
So like a mega church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, are you saying the names of people who've been murdered by ICE? Are you talking about ICE at all? Whether if it's the whole sermon or just acknowledging at the
Yeah.
beginning? And no. And I'm just like, there's no excuse
No.
why not to, like, unless you're worried about upsetting powerful people in your church or people leaving or just the backlash. And like, she feels, I think, obviously, like, very anti-ICE, but I don't know if things aren't just real to people or they're more removed. And it's still a white majority church, but they do have a lot of, especially immigrants, I'd say. And the church does do a lot with immigrants and ministries,
Mm.
overseas and domestic. So they are involved. But so she was like, well, like, we still do this with immigrants. But I'm like, yeah, but just like, this is the most like humanitarian crisis in our country right now. And to just not acknowledge anything like that is so, maybe it shouldn't be shocking, but it was just so shocking because in my mind, I was like, Mom, there's no excuse. There's nothing you can say, like, to not say this. So I don't know. That just, all that reminded me was just your talking was like, there is no clarity there. You're not, how do you be a pastor and like to not use the platform for thousands of people that you have on a weekly basis is like super dangerous, super just messed up. Like you're neglecting
Yeah.
just what you should be doing.
How did she respond to that? And kudos to you for having the ability to bring that up to your mom.
She, like, she's very gentle, like, I don't know, just, well, I don't know, like, we are doing this in our community. I'm like, okay, that's the separate, yes, you're helping the immigrants in your midst, but like to not speak, like, there's nothing, it's problematic when it's such a big thing and you're not forthrightly, directly saying it. They're not doing harm. You're calling attention to the truth. Like you call out brutality, you call out, you like honor the victims, everyone, and she just like, I don't know, I was like, well, I don't know if I see it that way
Mhm.
or, and then I just ended the text. I was just like, this is too upsetting. So I'd rather
Yeah.
just stop talking about it.
Yeah. No, and thank you for bringing that up and for having that dialogue with your family. That's if more people were having those dialogues with their family, can you imagine how different the state of affairs would be? But I mean, I'll be honest, I think see you, Ann. Yeah. Every time anybody gets up to like Ellie went to go check her car, people are like, "Are they upset?" I'm done with this radical leftist church. No, but I think it's obvious why so many of those churches do not want to touch this hot potato because it's divisive. And they don't want to get political, and they're very afraid of centrists in their congregation or people on the right in their congregation feeling like, well, this has become a political church. I don't want to be a part of this. I don't want to go someplace that's going to make me feel uncomfortable. And you got to ask yourself at what point, at what's it going to take to stand for a spiritual leader to stand up, in front of their, 1,000-member church? I don't know. I don't know. Those are good questions, but the reasons why they don't want to touch it is because they're afraid of losing donors and afraid of losing attendance and afraid of losing social power. You know, it's tough not to give them any sympathy. But yeah, no, I think that's why. What's that? Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I remember when I used to think that murdering innocent white people in the light of day would be the line
Right.
for churches like that. And it's I mean, stunning to me that it's not as much embedded racism as there is in that. I thought, there's no way that you can continue to ignore this at that moment. But Anna, your story reminded me of conversation with my mom this week. We do not talk about politics. I think I've made that clear. It would just tear apart any possible relationship. But I had this weird moment this past week where I talk to my mom daily. I'm walking the dogs and she says, out of nowhere, she says, "Julie, are you worried I'm going to be abducted?" And I and I was like, "Abducted? That's a word in the news that is associated with the news channels that I watch." Like,
Yeah.
what is she really are we going to talk about this? Like, has mom finally, are we going to acknowledge that this is going on? And she goes, well, are you afraid that I'm going to be abducted? And I'm like, okay, walk carefully on this line, Julie. And I said,
Mhm.
I think you're pretty safe, Mom, in your gated community. and she was like, oh, but, and then apparently the big story on Fox News was some newscaster's mother got abducted.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and so,
Savannah Guthrie, yeah.
yeah, okay, yeah, then it became like a mainstream
Oh, that
story.
makes sense now. Okay, yeah.
And I was like, I had to shut it down because I was like, how are we really talking about a single older white lady's abduction who is somehow a news story, even though my neighbors,
Right.
neighbors in Minneapolis, neighbors in Chicago, in New Orleans are getting abducted like en masse?
Yeah,
It's
and they're hiding in their homes. They're
insane.
hiding in their homes.
Yes.
Yeah.
She continues to ask me
Yeah.
daily.
Um,
Now it's a topic of conversation.
yeah.
Are you worried I'm going to get abducted? It's just surreal. It's
Yeah.
insane.
Thanks.
Anyone? Any more mom stories?
Thank you. Man, so many thoughts today. I mean, I love the talk, but everything that everybody has said too. It kind of going with what Anna said. I mean, I'm not conflating the two, but it just reminded me a lot of growing up in Utah and adjacent to the Mormon church. And I think one of the things that led me to deconstruction was just seeing the relationship and the treatment of people of color by these major evangelical kind of leaning Christian churches. And even as a kid, I was like, this feels off, right? And then when I left the Catholic Church and I was shopping around for churches, and I would go with my ex who went to one of these like warehouse churches, right? New Life in like Oxnard, I think is what they're called.
Oh, yeah, I'm familiar with that one.
Yeah, it's interesting. But going there, which is a predominantly like Hispanic community, and standing there and seeing all these Hispanic people and some white people peppered in, right? It's a predominantly Hispanic church, it seems. And yeah, the salt to the pepper. And I just remember being like, they're not talking about any of the stuff that's impacting you guys. And you're still here. That doesn't bother you. And then over time, it just kind of, this idea has developed in my head, the way that I see it, that it's the commercializing, the almost like itemizing of people of color by these big churches, right? They, especially like the Mormon church, they love to talk about how they send their missionaries out to the rural areas of Mexico to build houses for these kids and schools for these kids. And look at the great thing that we're doing. And then the Mexicans in the US go, wow, I should join the church. They care about my people. But they only care about you when you're in your country, right? When you're at home, excuse my French, but they don't really give a shit about you as long as you're coming to church. But they're not going to talk about the issues that are affecting your communities. They're not going to offer you help at home, legal counseling, grocery services, whatever that you need right now. But they'll talk about how we went to Guatemala or we went to Uganda or, and we helped there and it was great. And I felt the spirit and, we're the church of God and we're doing all these great things that Jesus wants us to do, but we're not taking care of our neighbors because that's rough. It's political and I don't want to get into it. And it's so fascinating to me that these big churches, something like a New Life, they are more worried about upsetting the 50 white members that they have instead of the 250 brown members that they have, right? But it's because it's like they don't really care about the congregation of color. It's like they just want you to come to the church. They want you to be a number, but we're not actually going to do things that actually help you. And that was one of the big things that made me look around and be like, maybe this isn't a space that I want to be in. And there was this at that church in Oxnard. I remember going and the pastor briefly touched on I don't even remember what it was at the time, but it was like the beginning of the amping up, and he was just kind of like, it's a lot is happening, and let's make sure that we keep our neighbors in our thoughts and prayers or whatever, which is their favorite line. And I just remember being like, I'm sure if I was like somebody who has, this sounds mean, but I'm like, if I wasn't doing too much critical thinking, I'd be like, nice. See, he does care. Hey, yeah, they do care about us. But I'm like, but if you're actually listening, it's like he's just giving you enough to keep you there and keep everybody else happy. And then they all pat themselves on the back. They're like, we do care about the immigrants. We do care about our communities. And I think it's just sad and this is a whole other topic, but I think it's so, for me as a man of color, it's so sad to see other, especially people who come from immigrants and immigrant families or immigrants themselves, fall into these churches and then just like get brainwashed into that thinking. There's a colleague, a classmate of mine that I just graduated film school with. She's Guatemalan. Her parents migrated to the country undocumented. And then like our senior year, she fell into this like evangelical church, to the point that we all kind of made fun of her behind her back. I did it to her face because I was like, I'm going to be honest with you. And just recently, my friend, I have to pull this up because it's crazy. This is triggering for sure. And by that, I mean, it's rage bait, but this was on her story. Again, this is a very Guatemalan looking woman. And she has just fallen into this hole. She says, closing thoughts. Again, the daughter of two undocumented immigrants. Closed borders are good, just how you wouldn't let a random person break into your house. We have to continue to be obedient to authorities. We do not get to choose and pick which laws to obey, just how we can't pick and choose which commandments to obey from the Lord. Let's continue to pray for this country, everyone being deported back, our citizens, our president, authorities, etc. And let's continue to point people to the gospel of Jesus. Crazy, right? And my buddy sends it to me, my friend who's also from Mexico, and he was just like, dude, what? And I was like, I don't even know where to start. I'm like, it's just rage bait. Like, I don't even, and it worked because I was at work, like, I want to like text her and be like, hey man, did you lose your mind? Like, what's going on? But I'm like, it doesn't matter, right? Because she'll just be like, I'm going to pray for you.
Yeah.
I'm going to pray and I'm going to hope that you find, and it's just,
yeah.
I don't know. I don't even know. It's just so interesting,
No, thanks, Jose. And, I think spiritual bypass is a real phenomena that we don't talk enough about. And just for a working definition, spiritual bypass is basically using faith and spirituality as a kind of escapism from having to deal with reality or having to deal with uncomfortable, scary, anxiety triggering topics like politics. And a lot of people go to church not to deal with real life issues so much, but in essence to receive certainty and catharsis and psychological relief from kind of the unconscious anxiety and the struggles we all have with life, right? Church becomes sort of an escapist kind of experience where you can go and not have to, again, wrestle with the difficulties of living and being in the political turmoil, and instead just say, I'm giving it over to God. It's all about going to heaven when I die and, health and wealth. And if I just believe the right things and attend church and pray and keep my faith, everything's going to be great. And I don't have to worry about all that other stuff. And that's spiritual bypass, right? It's really hard to go to a church that spiritual bypass is not like engaged in, where it's kind of like, let's talk about reality and what it means to be human, and let's talk about matters, love and justice, and what does it mean to actually, live justly and lovingly with each other, and maybe I think the best critique you could have of this community maybe is like, we're a little too hard on our former selves, but that's what happens in recovery. That's what happens in therapy. We're angry. We used to, but if anybody understands this stuff, it's us, because we were them.
I think that is true, and I think that kind of explains it. Why you have? I think it's like for both sides, right? For like the white evangelical, it's like you said, like, I don't want to. This is uncomfortable. I don't want to talk about it. I'll leave it up to God. And I think for the evangelical of color, it's like, I'll leave it to God to figure this out. We don't have to talk about it because God will figure it out for me, right? Which is, I mean, growing up Catholic, especially in like Mexican family, that's a thing that we just hammered home all the time. Leave it up to God.
Yeah.
God will figure it out. And my parents were a lot more liberal about it. So they were kind of like, yes, one of my parents, both of them love to say this. My mom especially, she always says, which I remember like being like, I don't think that's in the Bible, but I'm gonna let you believe that it is. She would always say, God always said, help yourself and I'll help you.
Right.
You know?
It's like, that's not actually in the Bible. I'm pretty sure that's Ben Franklin.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
God helps those who helps themselves or something. It's
Yeah,
actually
that's
Ben
true.
Franklin.
That's what I found.
A penny saved is a penny earned.
Yeah.
That's Leviticus. No.
But I always liked that because I was like, it made even as a kid, I mean, you'd be like, no, I have to do something in order for something else to happen. Right?
Yeah.
But I think that spiritual, I mean, that's a great way of seeing it, I think. And I think that really does.
Well, we're experts in it because we lived it.
Yeah.
No, but thanks, Jose. Yeah. Those are good
And then
insights.
the one other thing I was going to say,
Sure.
I mean, you were talking about like these sacred stories and how they have to be shared. And once again, it just reminded me of Wake Up Dead Man, which we were talking about before this. But there's a great line in it where Father Judd says, I think I shared this before. It's his quote about storytelling where he says, you're right. It's storytelling, the rites and the rituals, costumes, all of it. It's storytelling. I guess the question is, do these stories convince us of a lie, or do they resonate with something deep inside us that's profoundly true that we can't express any other way except storytelling?
Yes. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm super glad you mentioned spiritual bypassing, because I think it takes kind of insidious forms. And it's not just a Christian thing. I've experienced a lot of spiritual bypassing, especially from people who are sort of, Buddhist or Buddhist adjacent, or just super spiritual yoga, like people who say, well, I have no hate in my heart, so therefore whatever you're feeling from me is like so it takes a lot of forms.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say, and I don't know if I'd love to know what people are thinking about this. I mean, I'm relatively new here, but I'm curious if people feel like the ways that we talk here at Central, if you would consider that political. Because I think a lot of the spiritual bypassing is like, well, I don't want to mix church with politics, which is like constitutional, right? And I don't think we do either in the sense of politics, like Democrat, Republican,
Well, that's partisan. Yeah.
partisan politics. But for me, I have felt so comfortable, for instance, creating that text thread that a lot of you signed up for to know if we're going to demonstrations, protests, training, because I feel like, and I think it was Jason who said this at our board meeting this week, what we are doing is loving our neighbor. That what we are doing is fundamentally part of our theology. It's not partisan politics. It's literally living out the Sermon on the Mount. It's living out the Beatitudes. It's living out Matthew 25. But I just want to bring that up to like, not even necessarily now, but just like open that conversation, because I know that some people can get uncomfortable, right? Church is for a lot of people like where they go to be contemplative and spiritual. And I myself find a lot of spirit in struggle. And so, but I think maybe just as a church, again, not now, but like just down the line, like it might be something for us all to think about, just to define, what we think is political and what's not political. And just to clarify that when things that Aaron's talking about, the activism list that we put together, it's all about loving our neighbor. It's all about love and justice, which is, those two words are mentioned in the Bible more often than the word Jesus. So
good stuff. Anyone else have a comment this morning?
you go, Bob.
Just put it up.
Is it? Oh.
Yeah, it's one of the things I keep noticing as I try to think about some of the same things, like how are people not impacted more by this? And I forget how insular communities are. And then if you don't bring, if you're not personally impacted, you don't have to change anything. And then I forget sometimes how connected we are to diversity in our communities here. I mean, I was reminded of it last night, even when, I stepped outside to get something out of my car and, a police light shined down my driveway, and immediately it was like, it's a police officer, in their car. Like, everything okay, officer? And it was like one look of like, oh, no accent. You're a white guy. Everything's fine. Have a good night. And just, drove off. And I live in Pacoima, which is an exceptionally Mexican community. And I'm like, what are you doing? Just trolling through the neighborhood, looking at something you saw a movement, better make sure there's nothing nefarious going on. And it's just, stuff that I was never exposed to before being here in Los Angeles. But it reminds me that so many people connected to one news network, who hang out with only white people in their evangelical churches, like, oh, this is just a thing that's happening on the news. It doesn't happen around me, but it is all over the place. So the conversations like you had with your mom, like, those things are important. I know people where this is, like, people in my community. Yeah. Hopefully it changes. 3 more years.
Mhm. Good stuff, everybody. Well, let's conclude our time together. Every week we like to, well, that's good. Thanks for projecting that. I saw the projector light come on. I was like, what's he projecting? Cool. Let's say our joint benediction together, as we always do, as a way of ending on a really positive, life affirming, faith affirming note. Let's say this together now. As we go from this place, we commit ourselves to the path of love, honesty, and humility. We dedicate ourselves, as Christ did, to the cause of justice and the courageous embrace of this life, this world, and each other. Thank you for being here, everybody. Thank you for all of you who joined us online or who are listening to the podcast later. Go in peace.
Also, if anyone wants to go to Benji's for the Super Bowl or late announcement, come see me for details.
Thanks for listening in on this week's edition of the Central Cast. Hope you enjoyed it and hope you join us next time. Bye-bye.